The Enterprise is 20 years old. Why Star Trek 3 was wrong about the age of Kirk's Starship. When Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock arrived in theaters in 1984, it gave audiences one of the most shocking moments in Star Trek history, the destruction of the USS Enterprise NCC 1701. Watching Captain Kirk utter, "My God, Bones, what have I done?" after initiating the Starship's self-destruct was a seismic event for fans. The Enterprise was more than a ship. It was a character, a symbol of exploration and loyalty. Yet just before her destruction, Dr. Leonard McCoy makes a statement that still puzzles Trekkies nearly 4 decades later. Greater than, the Enterprise is 20 years old. On the surface, it seems like a throwaway line to justify why the ship is being retired. But the problem is simple. The numbers don't add up. Depending on how you track the Enterprise's history, the ship was far older than 20 years. So why did Star Trek 3 make this claim, and how does it square with the wider canon? Let's break down the timelines, the behind-the-scenes production decisions, and what this line really says about the mythology of Star Trek's most iconic starship. The Enterprise's on-screen timeline before Star Trek 3. The original USS Enterprise was already an experienced ship when Star Trek, the original series, began airing in 1966. Canonically, Kirk wasn't even her first captain. Robert April and then Christopher Pike commanded her before Kirk took the center seat. 2,245 according to official Starfleet records, first clarified in Star Trek, The Next Generation and later Star Trek. Enterprise, the USS Enterprise NCC 1701 was launched in this year. 2,265 James T. Kirk assumes command after Pike, beginning the 5-year mission chronicled in the original series. 2270s, after that 5-year mission, the ship undergoes a major refit, drastically altering her appearance into the sleeker model seen in Star Trek, the motion picture 1979. 2271 to 2285, the refitted Enterprise continues to serve, taking on new missions, confronting VGR, facing Khan, and ultimately becoming a training vessel at Starfleet Academy. By the time Star Trek 3 is set 2285, the Enterprise is about 40 years old, not 20. Even if you wanted to fudge the timeline by ignoring her earliest years under Pike, the ship would still have been at least 2 decades old by the time Kirk became captain, and nearly another 2 decades had passed since then. So, how could McCoy call the ship only 20 years old? Was McCoy referring to the refit Enterprise? The most common fan explanation is that McCoy wasn't talking about the original ship at all, but about the refitted version of the Enterprise introduced in the motion picture. This theory suggests that when McCoy said 20 years old, he was referring specifically to the heavily redesigned Enterprise that debuted in 2271. This makes some sense. The Enterprise that audiences saw in the original series and the one in the first 6 films are practically 2 different ships. The redesign was so extensive, new warp nacelles, saucer reshaping, interiors rebuilt, that in real-world production, the filmmakers built an entirely new model. But here's the problem. The refit was not a brand new ship. Starfleet canonically considered it a refit, not a brand new build. The registry number remained NCC 1701, and the ship's history remained continuous. So while McCoy's comment could be read as shorthand, this version of the Enterprise is 20 years old, it still doesn't square with how Starfleet would have viewed the vessel. Behind-the-scenes reason, dialogue convenience. The more likely explanation is far simpler. Nicholas Meyer, Harve Bennett, and the writers of Star Trek 3 weren't trying to create a flawless timeline. They needed a quick line that justified why the Enterprise was considered outdated and expendable by Starfleet. Calling the Enterprise 20 years old did 2 things for the movie's narrative. 1. Made her seem old enough to justify being retired as a training vessel. 2. Made her destruction resonate emotionally. If the ship was too young, audiences wouldn't believe Starfleet was giving up on her. If she was too old, the loss wouldn't feel as tragic. 20 years hit a sweet spot. It made the Enterprise feel like a seasoned veteran, but not ancient. From a script-writing perspective, it was an expedient line, not a carefully researched bit of lore. The problem with Star Trek's early timeline. Part of the confusion comes from the fact that Star Trek in the 1960s and 70s didn't have the rigid, carefully documented canon it has today. Dates, timelines, and ship histories were often fuzzy. For example, the Star Trek writer's Bible for the original series only loosely tracked dates, often avoiding specifics. Gene Roddenberry himself was inconsistent about when Kirk's 5-year mission began or ended. It wasn't until Star Trek: The Next Generation that a more unified timeline began to emerge, with official Starship registries and launch dates clarified. So in 1984, when The Search for Spock was being written, the idea that the Enterprise was 20 years old didn't clash with a rigidly established canon, because one didn't really exist yet. Only later, as fans and later series built out the franchise's history, did the contradiction become glaring. Could Starfleet have rebuilt the Enterprise more than once? Another intriguing possibility is that the Enterprise we saw in the original series and the one in the motion picture weren't just separated by a single refit, but by multiple rebuilds or overhauls. Some expanded universe sources like novels and technical manuals suggest that Starfleet often conducted rolling refits of Constitution-class ships. Instead of decommissioning them outright, they stripped down and rebuilt sections of the ship while retaining the registry and command crew. If true, this would mean that parts of the Enterprise, her warp core, her saucer frame, her nacelles, could have been only a few decades old, even if the ship's lineage went back to 2245. From this perspective, McCoy's 20 years old might have been literally true for some of her systems or structural components, even if her identity stretched back further. The emotional truth behind McCoy's line. While Trekkies can argue the technicalities, there's an emotional truth in McCoy's statement that perhaps matters more than canon consistency. To Starfleet Command, the Enterprise was a worn-out relic, suitable only as a training ship. To Kirk and his crew, however, she was family. Whether she was 20 years old, 40 years old, or 200 years old didn't matter. McCoy's remark was less about precise math and more about emphasizing that Starfleet no longer valued her the way Kirk's crew did. That's what makes the destruction so devastating. Starfleet saw a tool past its prime. Kirk saw the heart of his life's work. The legacy of the light. The 20 years old remark has lived on in fandom as one of the franchise's great continuity hiccups, often cited alongside other timeline oddities like Spock's age or the shifting duration of the Earth-Romulan War. But in many ways, these inconsistencies became part of Star Trek's charm. Later shows like Deep Space Nine and Enterprise worked hard to reconcile these loose ends, providing a more coherent history of the Federation. But Star Trek has always thrived more on allegory and emotional resonance than on rigid consistency. In that sense, McCoy's line wasn't wrong. It was simply serving a different truth than the fans who obsessively chart Starship launch dates. Conclusion: the Enterprise is timeless. When Dr. McCoy said, "The Enterprise is 20 years old," he was speaking a line written to serve the drama of the search for Spock. Canonically, it doesn't hold water. The ship was closer to 40 years old by that point, and her true legacy stretched back even further. Boo!